Paul Diera was not a man who sought the spotlight. He had never been one to attract attention, far preferring discretion to the flashiness of modern life. At 35, he lived modestly in a small suburb, in a modest but clean apartment, where every object had its place and every piece of furniture bore the marks of time. He had no big dreams of wealth or excessive ambition. He just wanted to live with dignity, do his job properly, and make sure his bills were paid on time. Paul had worked as a mechanic in a garage for around 10 years. His days were punctuated by the metallic sound of tools, the persistent smell of motor oil, and the incessant coming and going of customers. He knew cars better than some people knew their own family. When an engine coughed, he instinctively knew where to look, what parts to check, what adjustments to make. It was a demanding, dirty job, but he loved this almost intimate connection with mechanics, this silent language that he shared with the machines. His daily life was simple, organized like clockwork. He got up at dawn, often before the sun even rose. He was preparing black coffee, which he drank in a few hot gulps, his back leaning against the worktop of his small kitchen. Then he put on his work overalls, grabbed his bag and left his apartment, taking the same route every morning to the garage. There he spent hours plunging his hands into oil and grease, tightening bolts, replacing parts worn out by time and use. He loved his work, but it was exhausting. In the evening he came home late, his shoulders heavy, his fingers aching, often too tired to cook a real meal. He was then satisfied with a reheated dish or a sandwich swallowed in front of an uninteresting program. That day, however, the fatigue weighed even heavier than usual. A luxury car, an expensive German one, had given him a hard time all day. The engine stubbornly refused to cooperate, and after several hours of disassembling, examining, testing and retesting, he had finally found the problem. A faulty part that he might have spotted sooner, if he hadn't been so exhausted. This kind of day reminded him to what extent his job, as manual as it was, required extreme concentration. A simple mistake, a bad diagnosis, and everything could be compromised. He dreamed of a hot shower, water running over his tired skin, washing away the dirt accumulated under his nails, relaxing his aching muscles. He dreamed of a good meal, something hot and substantial, not a sandwich swallowed hastily between 2 sips of beer. He just wanted to sit, not move, forget about the day. But reality hit him as soon as he got on the bus. As always, it was crowded, filled with exhausted passengers, workers returning home after a long day. The air was heavy, saturated with muffled conversations, weary sighs and the lingering smell of the city. He found an empty seat near a window and plopped down, ready to close his eyes for a few moments. Then he saw her. Standing among the passengers, a pregnant woman tried to keep her balance despite the shaking of the bus. She wore a beige dress, slightly wrinkled, and her rounded belly showed that she was close to term. His face was marked by fatigue, his features drawn with exhaustion. One hand resting on the edge of a seat, she held on tightly, trying not to lose her footing with each sudden turn. Paul observed the scene for a split second. He could have looked away, as so many other passengers seemed to do. But he doesn't think. With a natural movement, he stood up and gave his place to her. "Oh, thank you, sir," she said with a tired but sincere smile, as if this simple gesture was an immense relief. "It's nothing, madam," Paul replied simply. She sat up with a sigh of relief, briefly placing a hand on her stomach as if to soothe the child she was carrying. Paul stood next to her, one hand clinging to the metal bar, watching the city pass by through the window. A few minutes later, the bus suddenly braked, forcing it to stop in mid-trail.
Ice cream pierced there.
Elise, unbalanced, wobbled slightly before recovering, but the tension in her body was evident. Paul, who had observed the scene out of the corner of his eye, reacted instinctively. He placed a protective hand on her shoulder to help her stand up. "Are you doing well?" he asked in a reassuring voice. She inhaled deeply, her eyes lighting up with a glint of appreciation for this unexpected gesture. "Yes, just a scare. My name is Elise, by the way," she added, correcting herself. "Paul," he replied simply, his tone calm, almost natural. A silence settled briefly between them, A silence that, instead of making them uncomfortable, seemed like a quiet break, shared in the warmth of the crowded bus. Then Elise broke the quiet, her voice soft, slightly tired. "Are you coming home from work?" she asked, curious but in a tone that conveyed a discreet form of camaraderie.
Yes, from the garage where I work.
Long day. Paul rubbed the back of his neck as he spoke of the fatigue weighing on his shoulders, but he avoided saying too much, a typical reflex of his. Never reveal too much. He was a man of few words. Elise gave a slight, tired smile, almost in response to her apparent exhaustion.
I guess.
I had a long day too. It's funny, I shouldn't even be up at this hour. My doctor advised me to rest, but I have no choice. She said this in an almost mechanical tone, as if this situation had become an exhausting routine, a restrictive habit. Paul, who was used to seeing people carry their own burdens in silence, raised his eyebrows slightly, intrigued but without insisting.
Can't your husband help you?
He asked, not wanting to sound too intrusive, but his instinct was to ask the question. Elise looked away slightly, her gaze lost in vagueness. She smiled, but her smile was tinged with sadness, like a facade that no longer quite held together. He's often absent, she said in a low voice, her gaze briefly avoiding Paul's, as if she was hesitating to reveal a truth that was too heavy to bear. But she added nothing more, and Paul, respecting this pause, did not insist. He understood much more than the words let on. The bus approached the next stop, and Elise stood up slowly, her hand resting on the edge of the seat for support. But a sudden crack was heard, like a shattering of glass, followed by the sound of objects falling to the ground. His bag, too heavily filled, gave way under the pressure and its contents spilled out on the floor. Groceries, a slightly worn book, a worn wallet, but also papers scattered in disorder. "Damn," she sighed, visibly more bothered by the situation than by the fatigue evident on her face. Paul, without hesitation, immediately squatted down to help her pick up everything. His gaze rested briefly on the fallen objects, noticing the slowness of his movements, the evidence of the weariness that marked his body. Perhaps the pregnancy, or simply the multiple responsibilities she had to face. While gathering the items, he turned to her. "Thank you again. You are so kind," she breathed, a tired smile appearing on her lips. She was visibly exhausted, her pale face and dark circles betraying her. Paul looked at her shaking hands for a moment as she straightened her bag. A feeling of empathy grew stronger within him. He wasn't used to meddling in other people's affairs, but something about the moment made him want to be there for her. Without really thinking about it, a thought crossed his mind, and he said, in a low voice, as if it were a simple suggestion,
Do you live far away?
Elise looked up at him in surprise, apparently surprised by this offer that came out of nowhere. She hesitated, mulling over the option in her mind. He could sense her reluctance, as if she were about to refuse out of caution, out of habit. But something in the tone of his voice, the sincerity of his gesture, pushed her to accept. "No, 2 streets from here," she replied after a moment of hesitation. A light breeze rushed into the bus, shaking some papers that remained scattered. Paul made a slight gesture with his hand, as if to chase away this little distraction. "Let me come with you," he insisted, without even thinking about what he had just said. It was simply the right thing to do. Elise paused, searching his face, as if weighing the situation. The distrust she had of the outside world, visibly reinforced by years of ordeal, seemed to soften for a moment under the warmth of his kindness. Finally, after a moment of silence, she replied, almost with a sigh, "Okay, thank you. I'm not going to say no to a little help." They exited the bus together, walking side by side, in the silence of the slowly falling night, each losing their thoughts in the flow of events, but connected by a simple act of kindness. Little did they know that this small gesture from Paul, this spontaneous invitation to support her, would be the start of something much bigger. A change that would affect their lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. The neighborhood where she lived was much more upscale than Paul's. Here, everything exuded comfort and opulence. Modern buildings with immaculate facades lined up with discreet elegance, protected by secure gates and discreetly placed surveillance cameras. The streets were clean, carefully paved, far from the damaged sidewalks and the tags that adorned certain walls in Paul's neighborhood. The cars parked in front of the residences were worth several years of his salary, gleaming models that gleamed under the streetlights, luxury sedans, imposing SUVs, and even a sports car or two that he had only seen in magazines. He slowed down slightly, almost intimidated by this environment which was foreign to him. Elise, who was walking next to him, seemed slightly embarrassed, as if she sensed his discomfort. "There it is," she said, stopping in front of a luxurious building. Paul looked up at the building. An elegant entrance, with glass doors framed in brushed metal, a bright reception hall visible through the windows, where a uniformed concierge was stationed behind a marble counter. He hissed internally, a world different from his own. "Would you like a glass of water?" she asked shyly, hesitating a little, as if she was afraid of offending him. He shook his head with a slight smile. "No, thank you, but rest well." She nodded, visibly tired, but before he could leave, she reached into her bag. Paul waited, intrigued. She took out a business card and handed it to him. "If ever you need help one day." Paul took the card without really paying attention. He mechanically slipped it into his jacket pocket, thinking he would never use it. He had already experienced this kind of exchange. Polite promises, gestures of gratitude quickly forgotten.
Good night, she said softly.
"Good night," he replied before turning on his heel and walking away. What he didn't know was that this evening would change his life. The garage smelled of oil, heated metal and sweat. Paul was hard at work under the hood of an old sedan, his hands black with grease, concentrating on a stubborn engine. He loved what he did, despite the fatigue, despite the back that strained after hours bent over cars. Here, he was in his element, far from the chic neighborhoods and luxurious lounges. He was about to tighten a bolt when his boss's voice called out to him, breaking the ambient hum of tools and running engines.
"Paul."
He stood up, wiped his hands on a worn rag, and turned to his boss, a pragmatic-looking middle-aged man. "Yeah. There's a guy who wants to see you." Paul raised an eyebrow. No one ever came to see him here. His friends knew he was busy during the day, and his family had no reason to visit him at work. Intrigued, he left the workshop and headed towards reception. When he saw the man waiting for him, he felt an instinctive tension knot in his stomach. The stranger didn't look like any of the garage's usual customers. Tall, charismatic, dressed in a perfectly tailored three-piece suit, he exuded an aura of authority. His stern jaw, his piercing gaze, his confident posture, everything about him exuded power and self-control. Paul frowned slightly.
"Are you Paul Diarra?"
the man asked in a direct tone. "Yes," Paul replied, his tone neutral but wary. "The unknown does not blink."
"I am Antoine Delacroix."
The name vaguely meant something to him, but he couldn't immediately place it. "We need to talk." Paul hesitated for a split second, then nodded and followed him outside. Once outside, Antoine calmly leaned against a luxury car parked nearby, crossing his arms across his chest. He watched Paul with a strange intensity, as if evaluating him. "You helped my wife the other evening," he said at last. It took Paul a few seconds to understand.
"Your wife?"
"Elise." "Exactly. She told me about you."
Paul tensed slightly.
He didn't like being in the spotlight, especially when someone as imposing and influential as this one came to personally speak to him. He glanced toward the garage entrance, as if looking for an escape. He didn't know where this conversation was going to lead. "I want to thank you," Antoine continued in a calm but assured tone. "You did what few people do." Paul shrugged his shoulders slightly, uncomfortably. "I didn't do anything extraordinary," he assured. Antoine stared at him with a half-smile, as if he knew exactly what Paul was going to say.
"Think again."
A silence settled between them, broken only by the noise of the garage in the background, the purring of an engine, metal tools clashing, a radio faintly broadcasting a song in the background. Then, without a word, Antoine slipped his hand into the inside pocket of his jacket and took out an envelope. He handed it to Paul with a measured, almost solemn gesture. Paul looked down at the object before raising a suspicious look at Antoine. "I don't need the money," he said immediately, his tone sharper than he intended. Antoine was not offended. On the contrary, his smile widened slightly, as if he had expected it. "It's not money," he replied with a touch of amusement. "This is an opportunity." Paul frowned. His instincts told him to refuse before even looking. He had learned to be wary of propositions that were too good to be true, but something in Antoine's attitude made him hesitate. This man seemed neither condescending nor interested. He just waited, sure of himself. Carefully, Paul took the envelope and opened it. Inside, an official document printed on quality paper, bearing the letterhead of a major automobile company. His eyes scanned the first few lines, his brain struggling to process what he was reading. A job offer. Then, mechanical engineer in automotive innovation. Salary. Much higher than what he was currently earning. Paul looked up abruptly, unable to hide his disbelief. "What is?" Antoine crossed his arms, watching her reaction with a glimmer of satisfaction. "I have a friend who owns a company specializing in automotive innovation. He looks for competent and honest people. Elise told me that you were." Paul opened his mouth, but no words came out. It wasn't possible. Him, a mechanical engineer in a cutting-edge company? He had no prestigious diploma, only years of experience and an unwavering passion for mechanics. He had always been relegated to neighborhood garages. Never had he been given such a chance. "Why are you doing that?" he finally asked, his voice slightly hoarse. Antoine looked him straight in the eyes, his expression serious. "Because sometimes, a simple gesture can change everything." Paul remained silent, unconsciously clutching the envelope between his fingers. He thought back to that evening. To this pregnant woman whom he had helped without expecting anything in return. To this luxurious neighborhood where he had felt like a stranger. To the business card that he had absent-mindedly slipped into his pocket, convinced that he would never use it. And yet, fate had decided otherwise. The roar of engines filled the state-of-the-art workshop, a familiar but strangely different sound. Here everything was high-tech, state-of-the-art equipment, cutting-edge software, a team of passionate engineers and technicians. Paul still had a hard time believing it. He was no longer in a small neighborhood garage, but in an innovation laboratory where the cars of tomorrow were being developed. He joined the team with apprehension, fearing he wouldn't be good enough, but day after day, he proved to himself that he deserved this place. His practical experience was an asset, his mechanical intuition impressed his colleagues, and for the first time, he felt that his work was recognized at its true value. That evening, as he left his office, tired but satisfied, his phone vibrated in his pocket. Envelope with arrow. "Thanks, Paul.
For everything. Elise."
He stopped abruptly, staring at the screen. A smile slowly appeared on his face. A simple gesture.
A Seat left for a pregnant woman.
And yet, it was enough to transform his destiny.